This is Evelyn Brooks, and tonight I'm holding a letter that should have burned decades ago. His name was Vincent Cardelli, a watchmaker in Brooklyn, 1973, and what he did in those final 6 minutes, well, no one saw it coming. I remember the first time I heard about Vincent. It was from his daughter, Maria. She called my studio in '89, voice shaking, asking if I could tell a story no one else would touch. She said her father died with a secret so heavy it broke their family in half. I told her to send me everything. 3 weeks later, a box arrived. Inside, 12 cassette tapes, a broken pocket watch, and one photograph of a man with kind eyes and dirty hands. Vincent wasn't special. Not in the way people usually mean. He fixed watches in a cramped shop on Myrtle Avenue, spent 40 years there, surrounded by the tick-tick-tick of 100 different heartbeats. His customers loved him, said he could repair anything, even the watches other jewelers gave up on. But what they didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Vincent was counting down to something. It started on a Tuesday morning in September. Vincent opened his shop at exactly 7 a.m., like always, but that day, he locked the door behind him, flipped the sign to closed, and he sat down at his workbench with a single watch in his hand, a gold Patek Philippe that didn't belong to him. Now, you might be wondering why a man who'd never stolen a dime in his life would do something like that. But here's what you need to understand about Vincent. He wasn't a thief, he was a father. And that watch? It was the only thing standing between his daughter and a man who'd been following her for 3 weeks. Maria was 19, a nursing student at Brooklyn College, and she'd caught the attention of someone dangerous, a loan shark's son named Paulie Driscoll. Paulie. He wanted her, not with good intentions, in the kind of way that makes your skin crawl. He'd wait outside her classes, show up at the diner where she worked nights, left roses on their apartment doorstep with notes that said things like, "Soon, Maria, soon." Vincent had gone to the police twice. They told him there was nothing they could do. Paulie hadn't broken any laws, just admiring a pretty girl, they said. That's just how some men are. But Vincent knew better. He'd grown up in the same neighborhood as Paulie's father, Dom Driscoll. He knew what that family was capable of, and he knew that if he didn't do something, Maria would disappear. That's where the watch comes in. 3 days before Vincent locked himself in his shop, a man had come in asking for a repair. Not just any man, Dom Driscoll himself. He'd placed that gold Patek Philippe on Vincent's counter and said it belonged to his father, that it was worth more than Vincent's entire shop, and that he needed it fixed by Friday. No excuses. Vincent had nodded, hands trembling, and promised it would be ready. But Vincent had no intention of fixing that watch. You see, Dom Driscoll collected 2 things: expensive watches and debts, and Vincent had learned something over 40 years of watchmaking. Every wealthy man has an Achilles heel. For Dom, it was that Patek Philippe. His father had worn it the day he built his empire. Dom believed it was lucky, protected, and Vincent was about to use that superstition against him. Vincent had always been meticulous. Every watch that came through his door was catalogued in a leather-bound ledger. Customer name, watch model, problem, solution, date in, date out. But what most people didn't notice was the small symbols Vincent drew in the margins. A star meant the customer was kind. A circle meant they were rude. And a small cross, well, that meant they were dangerous. Dom Driscoll's entry had 3 crosses. On that Tuesday morning, Vincent sat at his workbench and carefully opened the back of the watch. Inside, nestled between gears and springs, he placed a tiny piece of paper. On it, he'd written an address, a date, and 6 words: "Your son, my daughter, we're even now." Then he did something brilliant, something only a master watchmaker would think of. He adjusted the watch to run exactly 6 minutes fast. Not 5, not 7, 6. Because Vincent knew that Dom Driscoll checked that watch obsessively, multiple times a day. And if it ran fast, Dom would notice. He'd open it, and he'd find the note. But here's the part that still makes my hands shake when I think about it. Vincent didn't just leave the note and hope for the best. No. He sat in that locked shop and waited. Because he knew Dom would come. And he knew what would happen when he did. Vincent spent those hours thinking about his life, about the choices that had led him to this moment. He thought about his own father, Giuseppe, who'd taught him the watchmaking trade in a tiny village outside Naples. Giuseppe used to say, "Vincenzo, a watch is a promise. When someone gives you their time, you give it back. Exactly. Perfectly. Always." But Giuseppe had also taught him something else, something darker. In the old country, watchmakers were often the only educated men in small villages. They could read, write, keep secrets, and sometimes they were asked to do more than fix timepieces. They were asked to deliver messages, to broker deals, to stand between warring families and negotiate peace. Giuseppe had been that kind of watchmaker, and he'd paid for it with his life in 1949, when a vendetta he tried to stop turned violent. Vincent was 12 when his father died, and he'd spent the next 50 years trying to decide if his father had been brave or foolish. Now, sitting in his locked shop with Dom Driscoll's watch on his bench, Vincent finally understood. His father hadn't been brave or foolish. He'd been necessary, and so was Vincent. At 11:47 a.m., someone started pounding on the door. Vincent didn't move. The pounding got louder. Then a voice, Dom's voice, shouting, "Open this door, Cardelli! Open it now!" Vincent stayed in his chair, hands folded on the workbench. Calm, like he'd already made peace with whatever came next. The door burst open. 3 men stormed in. Dom and 2 of his guys. Dom's face was red, veins bulging in his neck. He slammed the watch down on the counter and screamed, "What on earth is this? What kind of game are you playing?" Vincent looked him straight in the eye and said, "No game, Dom. Just a father protecting his daughter. If your son harms her, and that note I left, it goes to every cop, every reporter, every judge in Brooklyn, along with a list of every business you've squeezed, every family you've destroyed, every body you've buried." The room went dead silent. Dom stared at Vincent like he was seeing a ghost, because here was this quiet, unassuming watchmaker, this nobody, threatening the most dangerous man in Brooklyn. And the crazy thing? Dom believed him. One of Dom's guys moved forward, but Dom held up a hand, stopped him. And then Dom did something no one expected. He laughed, not a happy laugh, a bitter, resigned laugh. He picked up the watch, slipped it into his pocket, and said, "You've got guts, Cardelli." Then he leaned in close, so close Vincent could smell the cigar smoke on his breath, and whispered, "Your daughter's safe, but if I ever see you again, if you ever cross my path, if you ever breathe my name to anyone, that protection ends. Understand?" Vincent nodded, and Dom walked out. But what Vincent never told anyone, not even on that cassette tape he left for Maria, was what happened in the 30 seconds after Dom left. Vincent's hand started shaking, not from fear, from relief, because he'd gambled everything on a bluff, and it had worked. You see, Vincent didn't actually have any evidence against Dom Driscoll. No lists, no proof, no documents hidden away. He had nothing but his reputation as an honest man and the desperate hope that Dom would believe him. And somehow, miraculously, it had been enough. For the next 17 years, Vincent never saw Dom Driscoll again. And Polly? He moved to New Jersey 2 weeks later. Maria never knew why. She finished nursing school, got married, had 3 kids, lived a normal, beautiful life. And Vincent? He kept fixing watches, kept that story locked inside him, until the day he died in 1990. But wait. Don't miss this detail. Maria only found out the truth when she was cleaning out her father's shop after his funeral. She found a shoebox hidden under the floorboards. Inside was a cassette tape labeled, "For Maria, If I'm Gone." She played it, and for 43 minutes, she listened to her father's voice explaining everything. The watch, the note, the threat, the deal. At the end of the tape, Vincent said something that still breaks my heart every time I think about it. He said, Maria, I know you'll be angry I kept this from you, but a father's job isn't to share his burdens, it's to carry them, so you don't have to. Even now, when I think about Vincent Cardelli, I wonder how many other fathers out there are carrying secrets like this. How many quiet heroes are sitting in workshops, offices, living rooms, protecting the people they love in ways no one will ever know. You won't believe what happened next. Maria tried to find Dom Driscoll after she heard that tape. She wanted answers, wanted to look him in the eye and, I don't know, thank him, curse him. But Dom had died in 1988, heart attack, and Paulie? He'd overdosed in 1992, so there was no one left to confront, no one left to ask. But here's where the story gets strange. That's when everything changed. Maria started going through her father's records, every watch he'd ever repaired, every customer, every transaction, and she found something that made her blood run cold. Between 1973 and 1990, Vincent had repaired watches for 17 different men. Men with names like Costello, Gambino, Lucchese, men whose fathers or brothers or sons had been threatening innocent people, just like Paulie had threatened Maria. And in every single case, Vincent had done the same thing. Hidden a note, adjusted the time, made a threat, protected someone. He'd been doing it for 17 years, 17 families saved, 17 fathers, mothers, daughters, sons, who never knew that a quiet watchmaker in Brooklyn had stood between them and violence. Vincent Cardelli hadn't just saved his daughter. He'd built an entire network of protection, one watch at a time, one note at a time, one threat at a time. Maria called me back after she found those records. Her voice was different this time, not shaking, not scared, just in awe. She said, "Evelyn, my father wasn't just a watchmaker. He was a guardian angel with dirty hands and a jeweler's loupe." The most shocking part was yet to come. One of the families Maria contacted, the Romanos, told her something Vincent had never mentioned on that tape. In 1985, Vincent had fixed a watch for Gino Romano, a mid-level enforcer. And just like with Dom, Vincent had left a note warning Gino to leave a young woman alone, Gino's ex-girlfriend, who he'd been stalking. But Gino didn't back off. He ignored the threat. And 2 weeks later, Gino's car exploded outside a social club in Queens. The Romanos swore it wasn't Vincent, said he didn't have it in him. But they also said this: your father knew people, people who owed him favors, people who understood that some men don't respond to threats, they respond to action. Maria never found proof, never found out if her father had called in a favor that day, if he'd crossed a line he'd never wanted to cross. But she did find one more thing in that shoebox, a photograph of Vincent standing outside his shop in 1985, and on the back, in his handwriting, "Some watches can't be fixed, some men can't be saved, but the innocent, they deserve every second we can give them." What you've heard so far is only the beginning, because Maria didn't stop there. She started reaching out to every family her father had helped, and one by one, they told her their stories. A teacher whose ex-husband had been stalking her, Vincent had intervened. A teenager whose bully's father was a known mobster, Vincent had intervened. A shopkeeper being extorted, Vincent had intervened. But here's the thing that haunts me most about Vincent's story. He never asked for anything in return, never took money, never sought recognition. He just fixed watches. And when he saw someone in danger, someone powerless, he used the only weapon he had, his reputation, his skill, and his willingness to risk everything. Let me tell you about one of those 17 cases, because it shows you exactly who Vincent was. In 1978, a woman named Catherine Wu came into Vincent's shop. She was a seamstress in Chinatown, barely spoke English, and she was terrified. Her landlord, a man connected to the triads, had been demanding favors, the kind that made her sick to think about. She'd heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Vincent could help, that he'd helped others. Vincent listened to her story, didn't interrupt, didn't judge. And when she finished, he asked her one question: "Does your landlord wear a watch?" She nodded, said it was a silver Omega, that he checked it constantly, that he was obsessed with being on time. Vincent smiled, told her to come back in 3 days. What Catherine didn't know was that Vincent had repaired that Omega 2 months earlier. He still had the landlord's address, his phone number, his schedule, and Vincent used that information. He called the landlord, said the watch needed a follow-up adjustment, offered to do it for free. The landlord agreed. When the landlord came in, Vincent did his usual trick, opened the watch, left a note, adjusted the timing. But this time, the note was different. It said, "Catherine Wu is under my protection. Hurt her again. And your bosses will know about the money you've been skimming. Yes, I know about the ledger in your apartment, the one hidden under the loose floorboard in your bedroom, 2nd row from the window." Vincent had never been to the landlord's apartment, had no idea if there was a ledger or a loose floorboard, but he gambled that a man corrupt enough to extort a seamstress was corrupt enough to be stealing from his bosses. And he was right. The landlord never bothered Catherine again. In fact, he moved out of the building within a month. And Catherine? She stayed in that apartment for another 30 years, raised 2 daughters there. And when she heard Vincent had died, she showed up at his funeral with a handmade quilt. On it, she'd embroidered 17 pocket watches, each one representing a life he'd saved. Maria still has that quilt. She showed it to me when we met in 1993. And I remember running my fingers over those tiny stitches, thinking about how much love and gratitude had gone into every thread. But wait, there's something else you need to know. Vincent didn't work alone. Not entirely. Over the years, he'd built relationships with people. Cops, journalists, private investigators, even a few reformed criminals. People who owed him favors. People who believed in what he was doing. And when Vincent couldn't handle a situation on his own, he'd call in those favors. There was a detective named Lou Brennan who'd bring Vincent cases. Women being stalked. Kids being threatened. Lou would quietly pass their names to Vincent, and Vincent would find a way to help. Sometimes it was a note in a watch. Sometimes it was connecting them with a lawyer or a shelter. Sometimes it was making a phone call to someone who could make the problem disappear. Lou told Maria that Vincent saved at least 30 lives that he knew of. 30. And those were just the ones Lou was involved in. There could have been more. Probably were. Lou also told Maria something else, something that made her see her father in a completely different light. He said, "Your dad was the bravest man I ever met. Not because he wasn't afraid. He was terrified every single time. But he did it anyway. That's what real courage looks like." I asked Maria once if she ever felt angry that her father had put himself in so much danger, if she wished he'd just minded his own business and stayed safe. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Evelyn, I used to feel that way. I used to think, why couldn't you just be a normal dad? Why did you have to be a hero?" But then I realized something. My father wasn't trying to be a hero. He was just trying to be decent. And in a world where decency is rare, that made him extraordinary. Let me tell you about another case. This one from 1982. A young man named David Kim came to Vincent's shop. David was a medical student at NYU, and he was being blackmailed by a classmate's father, a wealthy businessman who'd discovered that David was gay. This was 1982. Being outed could have destroyed David's career, his family relationships, everything. The blackmailer wanted money, lots of it, and David didn't have it, so he came to Vincent, desperate and ashamed, because someone told him Vincent helped people who had nowhere else to turn. Vincent asked David if the blackmailer wore a watch. David said yes, a Rolex Submariner. Vincent nodded and told David to go home, that he'd handle it. 3 days later, the blackmailer came into Vincent's shop for a routine cleaning, and Vincent did what he always did. Opened the watch. Left a note. But this time, the note said, "I know about your mistress in Hoboken. I know about the 2nd set of books. I know about the offshore accounts. Leave David Kim alone, or your wife gets copies of everything." Again, Vincent had no proof, no evidence, no mistress, no books, no accounts. But he knew that men who blackmail others usually have secrets of their own. And he was right. The blackmailer never contacted David again. David finished medical school, became a pediatric oncologist, saved countless children's lives over his 40-year career, and in 2015, when he retired, he donated $1 million to a Brooklyn community center in Vincent's name. Maria met David at the dedication ceremony. He told her that her father had given him his life back, that without Vincent's intervention, he would have dropped out of medical school, probably would have taken his own life. He said, "Your father didn't just save me from a blackmailer, he saved me from despair." Even now, Vincent Cardelli was still holding on to a belief, to a promise, to the idea that one person, armed with nothing but skill and courage, can stand between the innocent and the cruel, and win. Maria spent the next 3 years documenting her father's work. She interviewed families, collected evidence, built a timeline. She discovered that Vincent had kept meticulous records of every intervention, dates, names, outcomes. He'd hidden these records in a safety deposit box at a bank in Queens, along with instructions that they should be given to Maria after his death. In those records, Maria found details about cases she never would have known about otherwise, like the case of Rosa Mendez, a domestic worker whose employer was physically abusing her, or the case of Tommy Sullivan, a teenager whose loan shark father was forcing him into the family business, or the case of Elena Petrov, a Russian immigrant whose sponsor was threatening to have her deported if she didn't comply with his demands. In every case, Vincent had found a way, not always with a watch. Sometimes he'd connect people with resources, shelters, lawyers, sympathetic cops. Sometimes he'd leverage his reputation in the neighborhood, where people knew him as an honest man whose word meant something. And sometimes, yes, he'd hide notes in watches and make threats he had no way of backing up. But it worked. Somehow, impossibly, it worked. And in 1993, Maria published a book called The Watchmaker's Oath. It sold 14 copies. 14. The world wasn't ready for a story about a quiet hero who didn't wear a cape or carry a gun. A hero who just sat at a workbench and refused to let evil win. But those 14 people, they understood, and they passed the story along. And eventually, one of those copies ended up in my studio, and I knew I had to tell it. There's one more thing you need to hear. In 2001, Maria received a package. No return address. Inside was a gold Patek Philippe, the same one her father had tampered with in 1973, and attached to it was a note, written in shaky handwriting. "Your father saved my daughter. I never forgot. Neither should you. D.D. Jr." Dom Driscoll had a grandson, and that grandson had found out what Vincent had done, and instead of seeking revenge, he'd returned the watch. As a thank you, as proof that sometimes, even in the darkest corners of the world, honor still exists. Maria had the watch appraised. It was worth $340,000. She could have sold it, could have kept it, but she didn't. She donated it to a women's shelter in Brooklyn, and she had a small plaque made that sits in the lobby to this day. It reads, "In memory of Vincent Cardelli, watchmaker, father, guardian, who taught us that time is not something we own, it's something we protect, for those who come after us." I visited that shelter last year, stood in front of that plaque for a long time, and I thought about all the women who walk past it every day, women escaping violence, women rebuilding their lives, women who have no idea that a watchmaker they never met is still protecting them, decades after his death. That's the legacy Vincent left behind. Not money, not fame, just protection, just time, just the knowledge that somewhere in Brooklyn, a man once sat at a workbench and decided that the innocent mattered more than his own safety. But the story doesn't end there. Because in 2003, something remarkable happened. A journalist named Marcus Webb read Maria's book. He was one of the original 14. And Marcus decided to investigate Vincent's story further. He tracked down every family Maria had mentioned, interviewed them, verified the details, and then he wrote an article for the New York Times called "The Watchmaker Who Saved Brooklyn." The article went viral. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know about Vincent Cardelli. PBS made a documentary. NPR did a podcast series. Schools started teaching his story in ethics classes. And Maria's book? It was reprinted. This time, it sold 200,000 copies. But here's what I found most beautiful about the whole thing. After the article came out, Maria started receiving letters, hundreds of them, from people all over the country, all over the world, telling her about the Vincents in their own lives, the quiet heroes who'd helped them when no one else would, the neighbors who'd intervened, the teachers who'd stood up, the strangers who'd chosen courage over comfort. Maria kept every single letter, and in 2008 she published a second book called The Watchmaker's Legacy. It was a collection of those stories, proof that Vincent wasn't unique. He was just one of countless ordinary people who choose, every single day, to protect the vulnerable. I think about Vincent a lot these days, especially when the world feels heavy, when it feels like the bad guys always win. Because Vincent's story reminds me that they don't. Not always. Sometimes, a watchmaker in Brooklyn locks his door, adjusts a timepiece 6 minutes fast, and changes the course of 17 lives. Maybe 30, maybe more, and maybe, just maybe, that's enough. Maria passed away in 2019. Cancer. But before she died, she asked me to keep telling her father's story. She said, "People need to know that heroes don't have to be loud. They don't have to be strong. They just have to care enough to act." So I'm acting. I'm telling you about Vincent Cardelli, about the watches he fixed and the lives he saved, about the notes he hid and the threats he made, about the quiet courage it takes to stand up to evil when you have nothing but skill and stubbornness on your side. I want to leave you with one final thought, one final piece of Vincent's story that Maria shared with me right before she died. In Vincent's safety deposit box, along with all those records, there was one more item. A letter, addressed to Maria, written in 1989, a year before he died. In it, Vincent wrote this: "My dearest Maria, if you're reading this, then you know what I've been doing all these years, and I imagine you're angry, or confused, or scared, maybe all three. But I want you to understand something. I didn't do any of this because I thought I was special. I did it because I knew I was ordinary, just a man with a skill and a choice. And every single day, I chose to use that skill to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Was it dangerous? Yes. Was it foolish? Probably. But was it right? I believe so. Because at the end of the day, we're not measured by how long we live. We're measured by what we do with the time we're given. And I chose to give my time to others. I hope you can forgive me for the secrets, for the fear I must have caused you if you ever found out. But I also hope you're proud, because everything I did with love. For you, for them, for the belief that good men must act, or evil men will win. I love you, Maria. Always. Your father, Vincent." When Maria read me that letter, we both cried, because in those words, we heard the voice of every parent who's ever sacrificed for their child, every person who's ever stood up when it would have been easier to sit down, every soul who's ever chosen love over fear. This is Evelyn Brooks, and that was the story of Vincent Cardelli, the man who stole time to save lives. If his story meant something to you, I hope you'll remember it, share it, because the world needs more Vincents, more quiet guardians, more people willing to risk everything for 6 minutes of protection. Thank you for listening. Until next time, keep your hearts open and your memories close. Good night.